and welcome back to the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon. I'm Reverend Mary Hawk, and with me is Reverend Alan Salami, and he's going to be talking about different world's religions to get us ready for the parliament. And I just want to thank everyone so much for being with us and donating. We are currently up to $620. Our goal for the weekend is 10,000. I am going to be posting the links in the chat. If so, please donate. You can also bid on the auctions. And Alan, I am just going to turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being with us.
Sure thing. If nothing else, I can talk. And I'm going to be here for the next couple of hours chatting with people about the Parliament and about world religions. Now, it's been said that pagans do not have a holy book. We have libraries. And I certainly fit into that line. One of the things that got me into this path, just to introduce myself a little bit, was actually my brother. He told me that since I was young, and at age 7, I had open heart surgery, wasn't allowed to do a lot of real heavy activities. You know, I couldn't do sports and stuff. So he said, you should do this thing called yoga and see what it does for you. And I said, what's that? And he said, there's a book on it over there, which was a common thing to say in my house. What wound up happening was that became the entree point for me when I was older, and I started to look into Hinduism, into basic Eastern philosophy, read a little bit of Buddhism. I remember reading Alan Watts when I was in 7th grade, and I wound up finding a local yoga class in my hometown, which was a little surprising. I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That part that's usually most people don't think of as Michigan, they think of the Mitten. Well, I'm from the upper part that's bordering Lake Superior. And we are pretty rural. Matter of fact, the background here, even though it's Indiana, is pretty typical of Midwest forests. And you could easily see something like that around in my area. But I wound up taking the yoga class and started to look into a lot of different religions. Surprisingly, in my hometown, I could, of course, go to Christian meetings and things like that, but there was a neighbor who was a Baha'i, and I'll talk about that later. And there were enough places that there was a little bit of entree, and I had a local university, at that time it was just a college, that had a fairly good section of books on world religion. So I started off as being a seeker. And by the time I was about 16, I was actually teaching Hatha yoga classes. Now, that gave me real nerd credit. And yeah, I was not popular with the girls because I wasn't the football guy and that sort of thing. But I was on my own path. Once I got to university, I started taking courses and meeting people. Especially Ann Arbor, Michigan was great for it. I would go from meditation at the Kashmir Shaivite place for Swami Muktananda and go and walk over to hang out with the Quakers. And so it allowed me to do a lot of exploration. It wasn't until I read a book, which I highly recommend to every beginner, a book called Real Magic by Isaac Bonowitz, that I said, hey, these people who are doing magic and stuff, this makes certain kinds of sense. And so I started to plunge into that direction. And once I got out of university with a master's degree in social work, I wound up coming to Chicago and met my first teacher, a woman by the name of Krista Hayden Landon, whom some of you in Minnesota may actually know. She was very active in, as they call it, Piganistan up there. And she gave me a very valuable introductory class. And then I worked with my other teacher in Chicago Well, I was initiated back in 1985. So my lineage, for those people who think about lineage, is it's both to the Golden Dawn tradition, and also I have lineage to Gardnerian tradition. And we wound up combining sort of the left brain Hermeticism and Kabbalistic thinking with the right brain Wicca ecstatic religion. And our system had 4 different levels, which we used from the 4 elements. That was called the Pagan Way tradition, and there are still a few people that are out there still practicing that tradition in one way or another. But along the way, I always continued my fascination for various religions. And so, what I wanted to do is talk about who could get along with Wiccans, who obviously wouldn't, but maybe you could make some bridges there. And maybe even talk about a few religions that you don't know anything about, and kind of give you some background. Part of this is because at the Parliament of Religions in 1993, when I went to what was the second parliament, couldn't go to the first one, it was 1893. Although, interestingly enough, there are some rumors, we haven't been able to substantiate it with research. There may have actually been Correllians at the 1893 Parliament. I remember talking with Lord Ed about it, and there were Correllians in Indiana, and they may have managed to make it up to Chicago for it. So, in any case, back in 1993, there were obviously a few folks from different religions. And the neat thing about that parliament is that they were at first wondering, where are they going to get a hold of all these different faiths? You know, where could they look? Well, what they found was within a few miles of Chicago, being the incredible metropolitan place that it was, they found all of the different faiths, just about everything. Now, there were some even very obscure ones that they were able to make connections with. And basically, I was in hog heaven being at the Parliament in 93. We had representation from Wicca. There was actually a Wiccan ritual in one of the major parks in Chicago. And we had to get special permission. There was some political stuff around that. You could talk to people about the battle for that. But we had a lot of press for that. We also had certain churches leave because we were there. But for the most part, we got along with everybody. And it was the very beginning of us being recognized by the international community as being a legitimate faith group. We still had a lot to do in order to make things a little bit more clear about what our beliefs were and everything. But what wound up happening was it started a pattern. And Sir Ed Hubbard was very involved with that first parliament. And that was one of the entree points for Correllians to be involved with the parliament. And Correllians have been going ever since. I haven't made it to one yet, and I'm hoping to make it to Chicago this time, depending on, well, mostly finances and a few other things. Transportation's a little challenging up here. I am 6 hours from Chicago, in spite of being in Michigan. To get to Chicago, I have to go all the way through Wisconsin and cut across the state. So there aren't a lot of easy routes there. But in any case, aside from all of that, my object here is to give you a broad idea of some of the different faiths that will be showing up, maybe some of the ones you haven't heard of, or maybe a little bit of an analysis that you may not know about certain other faiths and what some of the background is. One of the things that I wanted to mention is we could sort of take the faiths that are going to be there and look at them from a geographic viewpoint. And that's one way of seeing what's up. One of the other ways of looking is, do they have a sacred book, or are they based more on tradition? Are they based on tradition and a sacred book? Or do they come from an oral tradition like the Native Americans or the Australian Aboriginal tribes? One of the things, of course, that makes Wicca different is we don't have a sacred book, except you write your own, if you do a book of shadows, in which you write down literally your diary, your explorations of the path, your experiences, and the ways that you work with the world and with the divine. Yeah, putting down spells would be one way of doing it, but writing rituals and that sort of thing, or copying over a book that your teacher gives you. So we do have a way of preserving things in words, but we don't have them in quite the same way that some of the other faiths do. So let me start off with something that you may think you know, but I just learned a little bit about recently. For one thing, I had this wonderful free class from Dr. Ryan Quinn. Dr. Quinn is an archaeologist. Now, I found out that there are two different types of archaeologists. One is the type that is out there digging around in things and digging pits and finding stuff and wanting to be Indiana Jones. And the other type of archaeologist is the one who sits late at night in the laboratory looking at artifacts. And oftentimes they are the ones that are looking at, tiny scraps of things, trying to fit them together to see what language it is, what kinds of symbols and whatnot. And Dr. Quinn was one of the latter. So he didn't get shot at, unlike some of their friends. And what I learned from Dr. Quinn was about Canaanite religion. You might think, well, Canaanite, isn't that something like Bible or something like that? Well, if you look at the Bible says that the Jews came into the land of Israel, Palestine, and wiped out all the Canaanites. But that's just what the Bible says. Actually, what happened was the Canaanites and the Canaanite religion were part of the entire Semitic background of the Middle East. And they spoke languages that were similar to and related to Hebrew and Arabic. And the gods that they had were actually really interesting because some of those gods and experiences and things that were in their mythology, well, they were very similar to the Hebrew gods. For instance, in some of the literature that we have passed down, we find that, some of the characters in the Bible, the Canaanites actually knew more about them than got put into the Hebrew Torah. The names of some of the people from some of the early stories, especially in Genesis, were actually in there. So what happens is, people were all interconnected back then. And the Canaanites wound up later being called the Phoenicians. And those Phoenicians / Canaanites actually were a lot of the influence in the Middle East, all the way to Egypt, where they had colonies, and some of the Egyptian gods were actually Canaanite. They also went to the West, and guess what? Some of the Greek gods were Canaanite, especially some of the early ones, and some of the Titans were Canaanite deities. So there are a lot of pagan roots to some of the Middle Eastern faiths, even recognized now by scholars. Part of the difficulty, though, with the Canaanite studies, as I heard from Dr. Ryan, is that a lot of the archaeologists running around, especially in Palestine, Israel, were trying to prove things from the Bible. And they would ignore a lot of stuff. And a lot of the things that Dr. Ryan was looking at was because they weren't looking at it from that biblical viewpoint. There's some really interesting radical things. The Canaanites, for instance, I think it was 6 genders was what they considered to be normal. And in fact, if you look at some of the early material that's in the Torah and the Mishnah and some of these other things, the Hebrews also recognize more than two genders, at least three. And there are mentions and things in Jewish law for those kinds of considerations. In any case, we have that as the background. And so we have a lot of different gods that people have heard of or thought were around, but that whole stream continued on, and different groups went in different directions depending on who they worked with and which deities they worked with. For instance, it's pretty obvious that the female deities were pushed out by the later rabbinical Judaism. But interestingly enough, I just ran across a book. There was a woman who was a marvelous teacher. I met her at the Starwood Festival, named Elishiva, and she just put out a book on Hebrew lot magic. You've heard of people saying, well, that was just his lot in life, or, that was, they cast lots for this or that. Well, basically, it was a sortilege method of divination that the Hebrews used. And this brand new book that is out will teach you the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and how to use them for divination. And that particular group is from the Haaretz, the people of the earth, who follow the Hebrew traditions, but they do not do rabbinic Judaism, and thus they look at the Elohim, the forces, the deities that the ancient Hebrews, before they became Jews, worshipped. So interestingly enough, that could be one point that you could talk to your local rabbi if you ever chat with them. They may or may not know about some of this, depending on which rabbinical school they went to or how well studied they are. But it's something certainly to consider. The other thing is, if you're looking at Judaism, the thing to keep in mind is the strong tribal sense. This is a tribe that made good, and there is a real sense of unity amongst all of the Jewish people, one way or another. Not all of them follow all of the laws. There are different interpretations of the laws, but interestingly enough, there can be a wide variety of belief in Judaism. It's even possible to be a believer in reincarnation in certain branches of Judaism. Others will say, no, what's important is to follow the law and to do these practices. And it's the practices and the traditions that build us together as a particular tribe and as a people. In that sense, interestingly enough, I think that there is a parallel with the neo-pagans. You'll know that if you've been around the craft and hanging out at pagan events, there are plenty of different divisions to our own faiths. Wicca is one tradition. It certainly is marked into a lot of different traditions and lineages that vary. But one of the things that seems to unite all of the neo-pagans is we have similar practices. And that idea of having similar practices for people is one of the things that we could talk about when we're talking with Jewish folks and with people at the parliament, and discuss some of the ancient history, some of the things, some of the roots, and some of the traditions that things have come from. Think about it. The Jewish diaspora, fancy word for a scattering of people, came after Rome took over the area. But even before that, there were Jews that wandered all around the world. Matter of fact, there are tombstones in China with Hebrew writing on them. And millions of Chinese legally are probably Jews if they could only trace their lineage from the mother through the mother and the mother. And they would find themselves that they are actually Jewish. So the Jewish people have scattered all over the world. And what unites them are these traditions that For instance, Passover, and the idea that history is alive and history is an example to us of what we can learn from. In the same way, we can look at history that's happened within Wicca too. Well, some people say it's only about 50 years old. Well, that's a great deal of controversy, and I'm not going to really touch on this here. But some people consider Wicca to be something amongst the new religions. Others talk about it being a revival and having inspiration from a long time ago. The interesting thing about the Correllian tradition is that it's a combination of both Native American, because it was a family tradition, as well as the Native American family finding out that there was this tradition called spiritualism in America, especially in the late 1800s, and they decided that they would become a spiritualist church. In the same way, then, they also discovered that, our native beliefs later on are adaptable and perfectly fine with Wicca. So the Correllians have been very adaptable over the years, and they have always kept in mind their ancestors and their lineage and the people that they came from, exactly the same as many of the Hebrew Jewish traditions. So that's one thing that can be emphasized when talking with them. Yeah, they have the idea that you have to believe in one God, okay? But keep in mind, as Lord Don had explained to me once, he was showing me a giant crystal with many facets. And he said to me, that's one of our most sacred symbols. Well, why is that? Because the crystal is one thing, but it has many facets. And so there's the idea that you could even make a connection to believers in Judaism about the oneness of things, but having many different aspects. And indeed, if you study Jewish Kabbalah, you will find that there is an idea that God sent down a lot of different emanations, different aspects of the divine in the process of creation. And if you look at the Jewish Kabbalistic diagram, the tree of life, it's called the Os Chaim in Hebrew, it shows different aspects of things, and you can easily map not only the tarot cards, but a lot of the deities onto it. And in fact, many neo-pagans will say that, yes, they're sort of polytheistic and sort of not, because they see the divine as being several different aspects. Hard to say. Your experience may vary and your conclusions may vary. But that, again, is one of the points that we can chat with people who are monotheistic believers. Now, let me take a quick look at the time. Okay, so let's see now about some other things. Yeah. I'm not used to this format yet, so I still have to read little notes and whatnot. Folks, there are, depending on how you're accessing us, there are places where you can ask questions in the chat. So please put some questions there, and we'll see about some of the possibilities of getting you some answers. Okay. So what happened historically then in the rest of the Middle East? Well, a lot of time passed. And we had the Romans come in, the Romans left, the Roman civilization fell, Christianity came in, moving to the cities all around the Mediterranean. Christianity was combined early on with a lot of Greek thought by St. Paul. And in fact, that's where some of the traditions that really kind of reflect some of our pagan ideas showed up in Christianity. And Christianity then tried to do various things to spread itself because of its doctrine. Now, interesting question. Um, and this would go with some of the other things. Somebody's asking that they don't have a tub to do a ritual bath, but could they do a ritual bath in a shower? Interesting point, because ritual bathing is, of course, essential for Judaism. There were various things that you had to do in order to cleanse yourself. Okay. Now, the basic process of cleansing and the whole thing in Judaism became baptism in Christianity. And interestingly enough, there was an entire tradition that then came out of Christianity and Judaism called Mandeanism, which traces itself to St. John the Baptist. And the Mandeans were in the Middle East and they were in Iraq. And they had to be near running water, near a stream. And the Mandeans, because of the collapse of the Iraqi regime, which actually, oddly enough, kept them relatively safe, they fled to Australia, to Europe, and all over the place. But they were considered to be people of the book. And so to some more liberal Muslims, they were accepted and as, sort of cousins, just like Christianity or Judaism was. In the matter of ritual bathing, which is a little bit of a off line here, but you could basically, depending on how you want to do it, in paganism and in Wicca, there aren't any totally prescribed dogmatic kinds of things for your cleansing. I have used a shower. It certainly works. You could actually do some things where you sprinkle some herbs onto yourself in the shower. Of course, using a bathtub, yeah, it's traditional. You put some herbs, you put some oils in it, and all the rest. But if you want to do the shower or just use the place for showering and put some water into a bowl, bless it, and pour it over your head, why not? Okay. It's the attitude, it's the idea of cleansing, and it's a way of changing your state for something that's coming up in your ritual life. So hopefully that answers your question. There's no dogma as for doing that. And using a shower or a bowl of water that you pour over yourself or sprinkle yourself with, certainly adequate. So let me see now. Now, aside from all of that, what happened when time went along? What wound up was the tribes in Arabia were still worshiping a number of different gods. At one point, I saw something that they had 365 gods. Interesting, because there was probably a god for each day. It was the Prophet Muhammad who put things together and had a download from the universe, from an angel, and started Islam. Islam had definite pagan roots, but because of the situation, because of the violence in the Middle East at that time, the thing is, you have to be able to, he had to be able to put together a community and to have it survive. And that's why in the Quran, you see a lot of things in there about survival of the group, about who's in, who's not, and the need for having protective war, jihad, in order to hold things together. But you have to also remember that at one point, Islam was considered to be a reform for a lot of the attitudes that were in the East. One of the things that happened was women's status was basically chattel. It was you owned your woman, and Islam and the Prophet Muhammad was a very early effort to reform the position of women. You may not think of that with some of the news reports and the Taliban and this kind of thing, but there were definite changes in the law, and women were given a lot of independence in certain ways. Yes, it was still circumscribed. They still had a lot of their customs and all the rest. But one of the interesting things that you could do is talk with any Muslim about what Muhammad did in his reformations of women's status. And they will be happy to explain what was going on before, what was going on during, and after. and how women's status had changed. So it's something that you can consider and talk about with a Muslim. Yeah, they are very hardcore monotheists. There is no God but Allah. But interestingly enough, find out what their conception of Allah is. I've talked to a Muslim who said, well, I think of Allah as maybe being the force behind the universe, and maybe the Chinese might call it the Tao, the way. And in some senses, Allah was not as much of a personal God, but more of an abstraction of a force. All of this varies, of course. And it can all be something that you can chat with a Muslim about, and what the different types of conceptions there are and how they vary in the different traditions in Islam. So one of the things I want to mention then is, what kind of Muslims are you going to see at the convention, at the parliament? Well, you have to realize that soon after Muhammad died, they had to figure out who's going to be running the show here. And what wound up happening was there was a big fight, naturally, succession. And what happened was Islam split into two different groups, two widely different groups, as a result of all of that. Now, some of this took years, and there were groups that split into different groups and different denominations and lineages. Just like most other religions, you will get people talking about the differences and where one came from another, okay? But one of the biggest ones is the Shiite versus the Sunni. The Shiite Muslims are the ones mostly connected in with Iran, and they're the ones that have a number of different teachers after Muhammad that were considered authoritative. Now, how many depends on which group that you are talking to, because some of them believed that there were only 5 teachers, some of them believed that they were 7 teachers, and others that there were 12, okay? And one group that says that they still continue. So you have the 5ers, the 7ers, and the 12ers. And actually, if you just want to remember 5, 7, 12, if you meet a Muslim, and if they don't say that they're Sunni, which means that they don't believe in that line, if you say, are you a 5er, a 7er, or a 12er, they'll think that you're brilliant and that you know, and that you're surprisingly erudite about Islam. But yeah, it depends on how many prophets, how many extra lineages of teachers that they had. Now, I did say that there is one group that still has a teacher going on. And mostly these are in Shia Islam. You still have the mullahs who have a lot of power, like the one who's running the religious theocracy in Iran. But there's also one group which you may want to explore or find out a little bit about, and that is the Ismaili Muslims, okay? The Ismaili Muslims are followers of the Aga Khan, who was considered a prince. I don't know a lot about the way that he became a prince, but the Aga Khan was the head of this particular branch of Islam, and the lineage is passed down in the family. And because of the social forces, because of who they were, and because of all the rest, the Aga Khan is somebody very, very wealthy. And they became somewhat famous because the Aga Khan of about 80 years ago, I think it was, married a Hollywood starlet. And they came even more into the world's eye point. Interestingly enough, I've heard it said that they have some sort of an option where they only need to pray 3 times a day. Don't know how that works. But also, the Ismailis are also tied in historically with an absolutely fascinating fact, and that is the word assassin. In the Middle East, at one point, there was a small group of Muslims that had holed up at a particular mountain called Alamont, and they had this marvelous fortress. They were in the middle of battles between different Muslim groups. And one of the groups, the story goes, used hashish and they used assassination as a political tool. And before they would do their assassination, they would use hashish, a derivative of cannabis, and they were called hashishans, which became assassin later. A lot of the Ismailis don't even know about this history. And in fact, there's some debate as to whether that's all together or not. I don't know whether it would be political to ask them about how they were descended from the assassins, but they have a tendency to be more on the mystical side of things. And so you can certainly talk with them about some of that. And they also have certain inner teachings which have a tendency to be reserved only for those people who've been in for a long time or for the members who are higher up in the hierarchy. But the Ismailis are spread throughout the world. They oftentimes are very involved in education. The Aga Khan helps his people out tremendously with scholarships, loans for business, and things like that. So they are very worldly, but they still maintain things and their practices of Islam. Now, branches. So I've only got so much time, and we could certainly talk more about some of that. I want to mention one other movement, though, within Islam, and that is the Sufi tradition. The Sufi tradition, you've probably heard of the whirling dervishes, or maybe you've heard of the Sufi teachers. They have a tendency to be on the mystical side. They have a tendency to look towards direct experience of the divine, much like we do. And, okay, I don't have my glasses that let me see the screen yet. That's next week, folks. So I've got to go through my bifocals. One of the things that the Sufis have is marvelous stories about crazy wisdom and teachers who teach by shocking manners or by jokes and stories. Okay, if you want to read something fun, there is a man named Idris Shah, Idriesshah, and he wrote these stories called The Incomparable Pleasantries of the Mullah Nasruddin. And they are these absolutely funny stories. One of them I can tell you, it's one of my favorites. You could even set it, I'll set it in the Chicago subway. Okay, so Mullah Nasruddin was in the subway, and all of a sudden someone fell over and the train was coming, and people were shouting, "Give me your hand, give me your hand," holding their hands out to try and pull the fellow up. The mullah came along and he said, Sir, what do you do for a living?" He said, I work for the IRS. And he goes, "In that case, take my hand." And he reaches up, grabs it, and pulls the man up to safety and looks around at all of the people who were dumbfounded and said, "Never ask a tax man to give you anything." Anyway, these stories are all throughout the Middle East, and they're told in the evenings and all the rest, and they are Sufi teaching tales. Also, you may have heard of Rumi, R-U-M-I. Marvelous poetry, beautiful stuff. Some things are out there that are attributed to him, but they aren't. But what winds up happening is Rumi was one of the founders of a lineage of Sufi mystics. So if you run into folks at the parliament who are into this mystical stuff called Sufism, you can have some great conversations with them or ask them about the funny stories about Mullah Nasruddin. And you would have a great time chatting about that. So aside from that, now we get to another line in the Abrahamic religions, known as Christianity. Okay. Now, most of you know about Christianity because that's our background, okay, culturally, historically. I have run across a few pagans who are second generation who really don't know squat about Christianity. And that can actually be a little strange, but a little refreshing at the same time. One of the things that you will hear people saying is that Christianity has pagan roots. And indeed, what happened was, as it spread across the Mediterranean and throughout the world, there were a lot of things that the church did to incorporate things in. This is being, oh, that's what's happening. Hang on just one moment. I've got a sunbeam coming in that I wasn't expecting from the setting sun. There we go. That'll make things better. So, yeah, Christianity spread a lot, but one of the things that you have to remember is there is one big difference that Phyllis Karat pointed out between our faith and most Christians. They see the divine as transcendent, as beyond them, as far away. You may remember that popular song, which actually I cringed at, was "God is watching us from a distance." Okay? Well, you may want to explain to most Christians that we don't see the divine as being distant. Okay? And that's one thing that changes a lot of our practices. We see the divine as being here and now. And because of that, people go, well, how can you tell what to do and what your ethics are because you don't have a book to guide you? Well, Phyllis made a really good point. The point that she had was that you would think that most people in the Abrahamic religions, if it's a mosque, it's a synagogue, or any kind of a church, would have a tendency to think of that place as being holy. And that you're not going to do certain things in a church that you would do in other places. Well, the thing is, because we do not have the idea of God as being only transcendent, but also immanent, right here with us, then we have a sense of the divine that keeps us on course. Yes, we do have the Wiccan Rede, okay? We do have the idea of threefold return. But by the way, the idea of threefold return is mostly used to get Christians to think that we don't do black magic. But the idea that the divine is here with us and that we are always in the sacred and we strive to remember that is the way that we handle our ethics. Also, if most people will think about threefold return, they go, oh, everything comes back 3 times. Well, if that was the case, most people that work in an emergency room would live forever because they save so many lives. I rather like Lord Don's take on it. And that is that everything you do affects the body, the mind, and the spirit. And in that sense, there's a threefold return too, which can be a really nice point to make to anybody when you're at the parliament. You know, what are your ethics? Well, we see everything that we do as having consequences, okay? And those consequences are to our mind, our body, and our spirit, 3 different things, okay? Something to think about and a way to make a bridge to people and to explain things to them, okay? Now, Christianity, of course, split into lots of things. There's the Catholic Church, which is the oldest, and then all the different branches from that. There were branches actually before Luther. There's the Moravian Church, which, by the way, if you run into any Moravians, they are about some of the most liberal-minded Christians you can run into because they will accept all of the other Christians as being legitimate. They split away before Martin Luther, and a lot of their emphasis is on good works. But they are a small church, worth looking at. And if you get somebody who says, well, I believe in Jesus and I'm still looking for a church, send them to the Moravians. They're pretty reasonable, okay? Then you get the other branches that came out from after the Lutheran Reformation. I won't go into that a lot, but you get a lot of things, everything from Baptists, which we will find at the convention, to Episcopalians, who have the same patterns as Catholicism, but they broke away due to politics in England. And some of the Episcopalians, also known as Anglicans in England, can oftentimes be fairly liberal. Remember, I said that when I was in seventh grade, I was reading Alan Watts, who was the person who introduced Buddhism and Hinduism to America in the 60s. He also wrote some books on LSD and whatnot. He was actually an Episcopalian priest for a period of time. So there's some interesting kinds of things there. And when I taught a beginning paganism course, I actually had an Episcopalian priest. They call their women priests, who is also a Jungian analyst. So the Episcopalians are pretty cool. You could probably get along with them if you're a pagan. And it'd be interesting to talk with them about what their boundaries are and how wide some of those boundaries can be, and what are the requirements just to be in that faith. So other things, Christianity, things to watch out for, okay? Yeah, there's going to be a lot of folks who especially have a difficult time with us. The Orthodox Catholics, the ones that broke away from Rome and have the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and all of that, especially with the Greek Orthodox, their history was very intertwined, and they knew about paganism because that was what they came out of and were converting people from. And that's, I think, part of the reason why they left the first parliament. But Orthodoxy also has some interesting points to it, because they have separated from Catholicism, and in some senses, they give you some wide variety of belief, because they say certain things are mysteries. And if those things are mysteries, you have the ability to believe whatever you want to believe. Interesting point. Now, enough of the Christianity. You guys are all familiar with them. Be friendly. Let them know that, we're not bad people and whatnot. But let's look at some of the other religions that are possible. One thing that is Christianity light that we definitely get along with, and a lot of you pagans know about them already, are the Unitarian Universalists. There were two different churches. The Unitarians were the ones that believed in only one God and didn't believe in the Trinity. And the Universalists were the ones that said, yeah, we believe in God, but we believe in helping people more. And we believe that God is too moral to give people an eternal punishment, especially since we are mortal beings. And they are the ones that believe in a universal salvation for everyone. And what happened was the Unitarians and the Universalists basically joined together in 1962. And if you go and look at their website, you will see that they have their points of belief, and none of them are especially dogmatic. And one of them, if you're a pagan, you're going to love: respect for the interdependent web of all being and all life, something like that. That's why there is a covenant of Unitarian Universalist pagans. And the UUs are so broad that, yeah, some churches are still focused on Christian Unitarian concept of God, but a lot of these churches are very involved in good works for society, in political work, as much as they can get away with it, humanitarian work. And you have everyone in the UU churches, from hardcore atheists to humanists who say, we don't care whether there's a date or not, we do know that there are humans and we're going to take care of them, to pagans, to there's even a Buddhist minister at one of the Unitarian seminaries in Chicago. And all of that is accepted under the wide umbrella of the UU. And in fact, those folks we get along with really well. And actually, if you're from a small town or somewhere in the Bible Belt, try and find a UU church if you need some cover. Okay, something to do. And those folks will probably be very interested in your viewpoint on things too. Okay. Let me see if there's any other. Oh, we have all sorts of interesting little things coming up in the chat, reminding you of where you can give for the Correllian telethon here. So please consider. I know that we're going to be taking a break in a little while, probably pretty soon, but we are raising funds to get representation and to get people who are, if they're not your belief, if you're not Correllian, we're pretty close, okay? And donation break is at the top of the hour, so we will have a break for you to do that really soon. Now, what else can I say? Let's take a look at another hotbed of civilization and where those people came from. India. India has an ancient civilization. By the way, if you hear something about the West having the oldest university was, like Oxford or something like that, folks, there was a Buddhist university in India. I think it was about 300 BC, something like that. It was called Nalanda University, and they are restarting it. They're getting donations to start that university. They had something like 10,000 students at that university at one point. People from all over Asia came there. So the civilization and what was going on in India was very, very rich. Most people think of Hinduism as the native religion, but Hinduism is an extremely wide umbrella. There are, in fact, lineages in Hinduism that are completely atheist. There also is a wide division in general, although they don't argue with each other, between people who focus on Vishnu and those who worship and work with Shiva. And that is largely due to family lineages and what particular kinds of texts they work with and the particular kinds of meditation practices they have. For instance, Swami Muktananda, who was very famous in the 60s and 70s, was of the Kashmir Shaivite tradition, and that has a very complex way of looking at things with deep philosophy from Kashmir in northwest India. The Hare Krishnas are in the Vaishnavite area, and they do ecstatic work with the divine, and they see the divine as being Krishna. Now, of course, anybody in the Hindu traditions in general is going to get along with us. Whether they call themselves pagan or not is a good question. I'm not really sure whether some of them say, yes, we're pagans. Others will say, no, we're not in the usual sense. A lot of them have a knee-jerk reaction because when the missionaries were there, they were calling all of these Hindus pagans. And in fact, with the Catholics, you could donate to save a pagan baby. And they usually meant either India or Africa. So I'd be careful using that term, but we share a tremendous amount with Hinduism. For one thing, they only wrote down their scriptures after hundreds of years. So they have a very strong oral tradition. And while they have scriptures, they also have a lot of lineage of direct teaching of spiritual experience. They also have a lot of traditions that are very similar to our magical traditions, okay? And if you want to go down a huge rabbit hole, you start looking into the word Tantra. Now, a lot of people think of Tantra and they think of what has become now known as Neo-Tantra, which is using sexual ecstasy as a way of knowing the divine. And in fact, there are things that you can do to get teachings and whatnot in that tradition. But the Tantric tradition actually made it all the way into Buddhism too and had a strong influence there. But a lot of these gods, goddesses of India, we do a lot of the same practices, okay? In Tantra especially, there is a way in which you take the divine into you. Just like when we are doing a ritual and the celebrants, the priest and priestess are aspecting the divine, okay? That is taking the divine in, identifying with it. That's a very important part of Hindu tantric practices and is a way of getting very, very close to the divine and being, in a sense, almost possessed. So that's one area where we have a lot together. And a lot of pagans have done yoga classes and have taken on practices. If you want to learn good meditation methods, go to a yoga class and find out some of the methods that they have there. If you want to learn breathing exercises that help to calm your spirit and your body, you can do that certainly in a yoga tradition. A lot of the times you will see Hindu priests in a variety of different ways. They oftentimes have orange robes, yellow robes. The Buddhist monks will also have some of those same colors. They will either be red or yellow, depending on the sect and depending on the tradition. But just finding out where they're from, what their tradition is. One of the things that I really discovered when I was at the Parliament in 1993, much to my delight, is people were so willing to share their beliefs and their traditions with you. If you were polite and asked a few questions, you could get along with them very, very well. They would be happy to tell you about stuff. I did run into an interesting thing, though. Speaking of India, there is one other religion that I wanted to mention, and that is the Jain religion, Jain. They are one of the three great religions of India. We don't know them much in the West, but they are where the Hindu tradition of harmlessness, of not doing any kind of violence, was strongly brought into Hinduism and influenced a lot of India. In fact, the Jain priests, as they near death, they will put a cloth over their mouth and they will take a broom and sweep in front of them so that they don't step on any insects or inhale them by mistake. And one of the higher things for somebody who is a Jain to do is to not eat anymore and to pass away from that, so that at the very end they are being harmless. Now, the Jains have a complex faith. They have a lot of scriptures. It's all done in Sanskrit, the ancient religion. And a lot of the Jains in the United States that have come here actually are very involved in business. So if you find somebody from India and they're a businessman, oftentimes they are connected in with the Jain faith. So it looks as though we're going to be taking our break relatively soon. And you may want to get your credit cards out or whatever. If this has been useful or fun, consider making a donation, even if it hasn't. If I've been boring you to death, please give us a little bit of money to help in our cause.
And I just want to thank you, Alan. This has been incredibly informative. I have been enjoying listening to you. And I am going to play the donation break video, and I will be putting the links back in the chat room. And I want to thank everyone who's been watching and has donated so far.
Yep.
You're watching the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon. The team here would like to thank you for all of your support in assisting us in bringing a contingent of paladins to the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, Illinois, August of this year. We are trying to raise $10,000 to assist with the basic needs of housing, food, and travel expenses. Here are some words from the members of the event team on why it is important that we reach that goal.
At the Parliament of World Religions in 2023, I'm personally looking forward to broad exposure and deep engagement with various wisdom traditions from around the world, particularly as regards pressing issues from today and future goals for our human journey. I expect that I'll be able to incorporate much of the learning back into my own personal path, as well as share tangible insights back into the metaphysical and spiritual community that I work within.
I'm Sir Brian John Ellicott, member of the Sacred Order of Paladins, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about the Road to Parliament 2023 Correllians Live Telethon, 50 hours of magic and community. We are here to ask for your help as we send a contingent to Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, Illinois, this August in 2023. We're going to give voice to you, to our community, during these next 50-plus hours to help raise our goal of $10,000 so that we can supply housing and food for the Correllian Nativist tradition members who are going to Parliament this year. And we humbly ask that you continue to donate and bid on our auction, get tarot readings and other divinational readings from our readers over in Divination Alley. And I again want to thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about the Paladins and why our telethon participation, your telethon participation is vitally important to our participation in Parliament in Chicago this August. Our attendance is vitally important. Now more than ever, we see the need for our freedoms and human rights to be defended and preserved. And as pagans, we deserve a seat at the table for those conversations. And the best way you can do to help us is to donate, bid on auction items, and get divination readings. I am offering readings this weekend over in Divination Alley. The link is below. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Hello, I'm Right Reverend Sir Elizabeth, Program Director of the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon. Thank you so much for tuning in to our weekend-long event as we raise $10,000 to bring a contingent of paladins to the Parliament of the World's Religions coming up in August. We need to house and feed about 20 of us over in Chicago for 7 days. And to do that, we're going to need at least 10 grand. So here's our ask. Go to Correllians.live/donate and make us a monetary donation to our cause. Every dollar helps. We also have psychic readers and an auction you can participate in too. If you can't make a monetary donation, then do us another very big favor and share the event with your friends over social media. You can find us on the Pagan World TV app on Roku, Correllians Live and Magic TV via YouTube, and Correllians.live via any web browser. Thank you so much for your help and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Reverend Mary Hawk, and I am a member of the Sacred Order of the Paladins. Why are we going to the 2023 Parliament of World's Religions? Because representation matters. It's important that pagans be there to show that we are a growing tradition, that we are a viable religion, and we need to take our seat among other world religions.
From all of us here at the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon, we want to thank you again for your support. Please be sure to check out Divination Alley and get yourself a reading. Or check out our online auction that is overflowing with wonderful craft items, books, and services for sale. Remember, our goal is to raise $10,000, so please help us spread the word about the event, our cause, and be sure to stay tuned for more. So thank you all again, and may you all blessed be. Enjoy the telethon.
And we are back. Thank you all for tuning in. Please post your comments in chat. Alan, thank you so much for joining us. And I am going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, by the way, people may have noticed, I wanted to let you know, this is not a Thor's hammer. You have to look at it very carefully. It's curved on the bottom. If it's curved on the bottom, it is Ukko's hammer. Who's Ukko? The Finnish thunder god. So just to let you know, if you see somebody with what looks like a Thor's hammer, but it's more circular, like a semicircle on the bottom instead of straight, they might be a Finlander. And you could tell them, hey, I know a Finlander. Yeah, I'm 100% Finnish on both sides. If you want to get into some good mythology, read the Kalevala, the Finnish epic poem. There's some wonderful stuff in there. But back to where I was talking about the Jains, and I went to the Jain booth and I was chatting with them. And also another thing is that they were explaining to me how they have a tradition that their priests, when it's really warm and everything in India, well, they go around naked. And guess what they call that practice? Skyclad. The reason why it seems familiar to you is that Gerald Gardner, who had the big influence on Gardnerian Wicca and much of modern Wicca, And he used the term skyclad because he was with the British Civil Service and was off in Indonesia and India and all the rest, ran across the term there. So interestingly enough, the idea of a holy person being naked is something that we are united with the Jains with. And that can be an interesting point that you can chat with them about, that there was an early influence on Gardnerian Wicca at the very least. A little bit strange because given Europe's climate and England's climate, skyclad, especially in the winter, is a challenge, but that's a whole other story. In any case, now we're going to go to one of the things that I find as the most interesting and where we have a lot of correspondence that can work really well. And that is the area of Buddhism. Essentially, what happened was there was supposedly, we don't have any solid evidence, a young prince who was very dissatisfied with life went off and studied with some of the major traditional teachers. He was very good at almost starving himself to death. He was good at meditating. He was good at this and that. Finally, he said, I'm going to sit under this damn tree one way or another until I get enlightened. He wanted to get to that state that was a legend amongst all of the other local religions, the Jains and the proto-Hindus and whatnot. And boom, he got it. What it was he got is a good question. But what wound up happening was he decided that starving himself was not the way to do it. And obviously, being a rich person, and which he came from being a prince, and just luxuriating in material things wasn't it. So he talked about the middle way. And he was rejected by some of his fellow people when he decided to go and actually have a meal, and somebody gave him some broth or something to drink, and they said, "What's up with him? He's going against it." Well, what wound up happening was he then started to preach his first sermon. And what he said was, look, there may be gods, and there may be all these divine characters. But what I know is that I know the way to get out of all of this and to stop suffering. And his whole method was focused in on dealing with suffering. And he said, there's 4 truths to this, okay? We know that life is suffering. More about that in a minute. We know that there's a cause to suffering. We know the way to stop suffering, okay? And that way is the Noble Eightfold Path, which he talked about. He was really good at making lists of things. Either that or his followers made lists from, his lectures. Now, I was always wondering about this, what's with this life is suffering, because I've had a pretty good time at times, okay? Of course, there were times that were challenging, as some of you may know if you've been around for a while. 2015, I almost died. I had 6 things almost kill me. I was in the hospital, in the ICU for a month. And because of my connections with so many different faiths, I had blissful, wonderful Correllian Wiccans praying for me. I had some Buddhists doing medicine Buddha chants for me. I had Gnostic Catholic priests like my friend Lon Milo Duquette doing masses for me to Archangel Raphael. I even had some voodoo people doing some stuff for me. Well, whatever it was, it got me back. But I had to think about that. And one of the things that a Lama once told me was Lama Nagpa Chogyam Rinpoche, not the one who was up in Boulder, but he's from Wales. He said, if you look at the Buddha's life, he was a prince. The stories were that he was the best runner. He was the best chess player, because chess is that ancient. All the girls loved him and all the rest, okay? And the story goes that at one point he managed to get outside of the palace gardens, which he wasn't allowed to do, And he was walking along. He saw some guy that was dead, and he had never seen anybody or anything dead because his dad had covered up everything. There was a prophecy that he was going to be either a great king or a great holy man. And he didn't want his son being a holy man. He wanted him to take over the kingdom. Well, he saw somebody dead, and then he saw somebody old, saw somebody sick, all of that. And what wound up, that started him on his trip, okay, of him looking and finding the causes of suffering. And what wound up happening was, yeah, he had it so good. But here's the point that the Lama made. Even if you have it so good, there's this little kernel, call it in your soul, whatever, of dissatisfaction. Is this all there is? Imagine somebody like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or, the governor of Illinois, Pritzker. They're billionaires, okay? Well, they find projects to do to give themselves meaning in life, okay? Siddhartha was in a similar situation, but he was totally shocked to find out that there was death and illness and aging and all the rest. And so he went off on his journey. But think of it. Even if you're a Bill Gates or you have everything that you want, there's still a kernel of dissatisfaction. The part of you that goes, is this all there is in life? That is the first noble truth. Dukkha is the Sanskrit term for it. And that is the basis for all of this. Now, why is there that suffering? Well, because we grasp onto things, because we want to keep things the way that we are. We, hold on to stuff. We get greedy, or we want to keep our house even though the flood is happening, or we want to keep, our partners or our money or whatever. So it's grasping, it's hanging on to stuff, okay? So the way to deal with it, the way to quit suffering is to quit hanging on to stuff. And the way to quit hanging on to stuff is to think right, to meditate the right way, to speak correctly, to gain the right kind of wisdom, and you're on this eightfold path, okay? Well, yeah, there's nothing in this that doesn't say that you couldn't do this and do Wicca at the same time. As a matter of fact, I've been focusing for about the last year on Buddhist practices, and especially the Tibetan Buddhist lineage. Because what happened was Buddhism shifted. It went into two directions. One direction, especially in Southeast Asia, kept with the tradition of being monks and that kind of thing, and going the way of meditation and whatnot. That's called the Theravadan, and you'll see in the diaspora community, there are still a lot of temples and things that teach straight mindfulness meditation and whatnot, and people go to them and they support the monks and all the rest, and that's their way of working the path. The other branch was sort of like the more, you could say, kind of Protestant branch that broke off into many, many different ways. And it was called the Mahayana branch. The Mahayana kind of looked down on the Theravadins. They called them Hinayana, the small vehicle. The Mahayana said, hey, we've got room for everybody, and we'll take in all these different practices. What happened in Tibet was especially interesting, because Tibet had a religion that was already there, the Bon religion, which was very into shamanism, had all sorts of deities and gods and whatnot. And in fact, they would be somebody that you would get along with very, very well if you're Wiccan, okay? But the Bon started to then be influenced by the Buddhists coming in. And nowadays, it's kind of hard to tell one from the other. And a lot of the practices are the same. But what wound up happening with Tibetan Buddhism is it was influenced a lot by Hinduism, by the teachers that came to Tibet from India, and by Buddha Padmasambhava, known as Guru Rinpoche, the precious guru. He showed up actually in 747. And the reason why I remember it is he was said to have flown in. because he had magical and mystical powers. Legend has it that some of the people in Tibet didn't like him and stacked wood around him and were trying to set him on fire. Something that I'm sure a lot of you know about from your reading, except a large amount of water fell on him and a lake grew up all around him, putting out the fire. And people said, oh, maybe we shouldn't burn this guy. And he helped to establish Buddhism in Tibet. He converted all of the demons and the other gods and goddesses and said, hey, look, I'm not going to destroy you if you become protectors of the Dharma, of this path that the Buddha showed. And because it was also part of this tantric tradition, which said, hey, we can do a trick to take our suffering and use it as a way to enlightenment, then one of the things that happened was Tibetan Buddhism flourished in all sorts of different degrees and different lineages. It was later on that one of the things that happened was it broke into basically 4 different schools, which are still extant today. And they have different personages that run them. Most famous one is the Dalai Lama, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to try and get Tibet to at least gain some autonomy from China when China took over in 1959. He is actually considered to be an emanation of one of the important deities in Tibet named Avalokiteshvara, or Chenrezig, who is the bodhisattva, kind of a god, not quite, of compassion. And what happens with that is that they have a fascinating tradition. Some of their holy people say, hey, I am not, and part of their whole tradition in Mahayana is, hey, I'm going to work on my enlightenment, but I'm not going to take the final step until everybody else is enlightened and until I have saved and helped everybody in the world, because that's the thing to do, to relieve suffering, to be so dedicated to kindness, to be so dedicated to compassion. I'm going to put things off until I get to the almost end, okay? And then I will go forward. And because of this, because some of the holy, usually men, were so high up, they said, okay, then I'm going to reincarnate again. And so what happened was it became a whole tradition of finding the incarnations of these previous masters. And now we have Westerners who are actually born incarnations from these various Buddhist masters. There's a woman on the East Coast who wound up doing a spiritual center, and they found out some Buddhists came and said, do you know you're teaching Buddhism? She said, no. They said, oh, come to our teacher. And they went to one of the Rinpoches, and these high-level high lamas are, well, they have psychic abilities. And they said, oh, you're so-and-so from this previous lifetime. And they stuck a crown on her head and called her a Rinpoche and said, well, we'll support you. We'll teach you the stuff that you just haven't learned in this lifetime, but it's obvious that you got the basics down and they were coming through you. So what wound up happening was that woman on the East Coast named Jetsuma wound up founding a whole tradition. In the same way, there is a Lama in Colorado named Lama Siltram Alione. I spent 2 weeks with her. She is considered a emanation of a very important holy woman named Machig Labdran. And Machig Labdran found a way of dealing with demons. And to do that, you actually give of yourself, of the impression of who you are. And you give up the attachment to yourself as a way of enlightenment. But by doing that, you can also deal with these negative forces. And the people who practice her technique actually go into places with plague and do this technique and clear out the plague, because they understand the spiritual truth of what's really going on. I'm getting some very nice points here. Thank you for all the compliments on all of this. Trying the best that I can, folks. So here's the thing. Some of the people that you will get along best with if you're Wiccan are the Tibetan Buddhists. Because one of the things that they do in order to progress themselves spiritually. Well, imagine you're a Wiccan and you wanted to get yourself prepared for a big test, okay? And you've got like some licensing test or something. What would you do? Well, you'd call in spiritual forces. How might you do that? Well, if your training is good enough, you're going to sit down and think, okay, what goddess, who could I ask for here? Well, if you're going for your degree in being a blacksmith, you would work with Hephaestus. If you were going to do something with the law, you would do Athena. So what might you do? You would sit down and bring Athena into your heart. You would imagine being Athena. You would imagine doing Athena kinds of things, like studying your law books and whatnot. You would maybe wear an owl, okay, and then go and take your test. The Tibetan Buddhists have taken this to an extremely high level. And the magic that they do is the magic of almost a kind of possession or identification with deity, so that you get enlightened by becoming that deity, by imagining them, using the power of sound, which is their mantra, the holy words connected to them, okay? And doing that meditation. And as you do that, more and more and more of you gets into your neural pathways, that you're going to be compassionate like Green Tara, because you've said her mantra 1,000,000 times. Om Tari Tatari Turi Soha. And believe me, you say something 1,000,000 times, you hook up with that energy. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, there are some Tibetan lamas who are aware of Wicca. I refer you to Lama Lena, Lena. Don't know too much about her. She studied with some very high masters. She's an older lady, wonderfully earthy. During one of her workshops, she says, well, we're going to take a break now. I got to go and pee. Just absolutely wonderful. Great at explaining things. And she will reference Wicca and a few other things. For one thing, she has something on YouTube where she says, here's how you get more prosperity into your life. Go outside of your mandala, out of your usual area. And when you see somebody driving a Rolls Royce, you think to yourself, how wonderful they have that. How wonderful. May everyone have that. May everyone be blessed with such wealth. And you see somebody with a beautiful garden or a huge house, and you go, that's wonderful. You feel compassion and you feel happiness for that person. It's called metta, okay? Which, for those of you who are into polyamory, that polyamory idea of compersion, where you feel joy in someone else's joy that you're connected to, that's a Buddhist concept, okay? So Lama Lena has some really neat stuff that she does, and she references Wicca. There's also another one. He's out in Poland, and he is actually worked with some ceremonial magicians. His regular name is John Reynolds. He does translations and all the rest, and he will do workshops over the net. And you can go to his Facebook page, Lama Vijra. Can't remember at the moment, but look up John Reynolds and you'll see. In any case, what I did with him was I worked with Standing Red Tara. Now, I can't say her name because when I got connected to her, there's a ceremony where you get connected. And that was one of the things that I took a promise. I don't say her name unless it's to someone else who has the same connection. But here's a picture of her. And guess what? She is supposedly 16 years old. She has the power of attraction. And she is shooting a bow with flowers instead of a arrowhead. And she attracts people to enlightenment. And she attracts what you need in life. She could be considered similar to Aphrodite or Venus, but she is also the Tibetan goddess of positive witchcraft. Yeah, isn't that something? It's a wonderful way to connect with them and to say, oh, Your standing red Tara, that wonderful, that power of attraction is just amazing. Tell me about her. And then maybe you'll hear the name from them if they haven't taken the same vow that I had to. But the Tibetan Buddhists look at the world as something which you can work with, because there are manifestations of reality, and the world is both real and unreal at the same time. The important thing is to find that reality, to get your mind around what really is real, and to find the basis of that, which is called Rigpa. And when you find the basis of that, there is this transcendent kind of experience of understanding. Now, the usual methods of doing this are these paths in which you work with these gods, goddesses, and do a whole bunch of mantras. There are other ones that are more rapid and kind of shortcuts. One of the groups that you may want to look into, because you can get some of these things, there is a Tibetan medicine tradition called Sowa Rigpa, Sowa Rigpa. Look that up online, because Dr. Nida, who is the Tibetan physician who teaches that, there are a bunch of workshops that you can easily take online. One of them will give you Tibetan yoga. It's about $75, I think. One of them, for a little bit more expensive, you learn this technique from this Machig Labdran, where you can work with and do things to deal with illness. And the technique itself is with a drum and a bell at the same time, and you actually sing, and you're giving parts of yourself up because you realize yourself is an illusion, and you give it up to the local demons and whatnot, and to the land spirits and whatnot. And you could actually learn that online if you want to learn some really powerful kinds of Tibetan magic. There's also an entire tradition that they do it once a year, I think. It's several days, but you do mantra healing, and you learn the particular mantras, you get initiated into them. And yeah, you may have to spend 4 days of sitting there doing them 10,000 times, or maybe you take 3 weeks. I'm not sure whether you can break it up that way, but you can actually use these in order to do healing with people and to bring things about. One of the things that is easy to do is to start looking at Medicine Buddha. Medicine Buddha decided that he would put off his final enlightenment until all forms of illness, including the illness of the mind, which keeps you from being enlightened, is taken care of. And Medicine Buddha can help you with illnesses and whatnot. I got initiated into that tradition. And there are places where you can work with Medicine Buddha, and even if you haven't been initiated, you can still imagine him in front of you and do his mantra and work with him that way. So lots of things that can be done here, especially on that Tibetan Buddhist path. And if you want to go into the tremendous sense of transcendence and what's really behind this universe, okay, you can work with ancestors. You can do rituals for your ancestors. You can do rituals to bring things about. So it's a real easy jump from Wicca to this incredibly sophisticated, wonderful Tibetan tradition of healing, both for the mind, the body, and the spirit. So there's all of that. Now, I wanted to also mention, what are we doing for time? Oh, we still have a good portion of time. I am also looking for questions here. And somebody is saying, you also captured my own personal path of integrating the Bhagavad Gita and Buddhist facets into my path, as well as Stoicism and Romanticism alongside Wiccan threats. You know, I want to say something about that. One of the interesting things that happened when Alexander the Great, who is a student of Aristotle, by the way, when he went out east and was conquering, he conquered all the way into India. And one of the great Greek philosophers went with him. And it was said that he hung out with all of those people. And apparently some of the ones that he hung out with were Buddhists, because that was after the Buddha had done his stuff. And he came back and he founded a school of Greek thought called Pyrrhonism. And Pyrrhonism was known as extreme skepticism, because in Buddhism, you go, well, wait a minute, is this true? Is this true? Is this true? So that you're trying to get to the real truth of things. And that thread made it into Greek thought. And I think it may have even made some of it into Stoicism, and certainly where some of this also moved and made it into just the West in general. As a matter of fact, I got an interesting story for you. The Catholics had done some studies a few years ago to try and figure out, and look into the backgrounds of all the saints that they had that were in their books and in their traditions. And they looked up this Saint Josaphat. And they started looking into the ancient texts and all the rest, and the ancient texts kept going back further and further. And the tradition of Saint Josaphat was traced back further, and he kept going further east. And they found out who Saint Josaphat really was. He was Gautama Siddhartha Buddha. So in a modified form, the Catholics were praying to Buddha for quite some time. Anyway, there's a marvelous book called The Shape of Ancient Thought, which goes into the Greek connection with India and all the rest. There was actually a Greek colony in India. And early Indian astrology, if it was in a primitive form, which I suspected it was influenced by Greek astrology because of the Greek colony and all the rest that was out there. We don't know how much went the other way, but the Greeks had picked up things, of course, from Babylonians and all the rest and whatnot. So there was a lot of interconnection at that point. So thank you for that comment. You got me to remember some of this and some of those wonderful things that we can put together and make bridges to other traditions too. Okay. Now, let me mention a few other things about some other Buddhist paths and then some of my other favorite religions. A lot of people have heard things about Zen Buddhism. Zen is part of that Mahayana big vehicle. And by legend, it was said that one person got it when someone asked the Buddha a question and the Buddha simply held up a flower. And that person, I forget the name, was enlightened right at that moment. And the Buddha bowed to him, showing, hey, I know you got it, didn't you? And that lineage continued, and it became Chan Buddhism in China, and eventually got to Japan and became Zen. So there are Zen masters actually who represent traditions from Japan. There are Zen masters in Korea. There are Zen masters from China. And there's a very famous Zen master from Vietnam named Thich Nhat Hanh, who just died a few years ago. Very, very holy man, very well respected. His writings are very worth reading, whatever faith you are, because of his insight and his wisdom. Zen sees it as a way of preparing your mind. And there are two different main branches of Zen. There's the Soto Zen people who just basically sit there and meditate. If you want to read a real interesting book, there is a Western punk rock bass player who wrote a book, and he's written a couple of others, but his first one is real easy. It's Sit Down and Shut Up, which I thought was just the perfect thing for a punk rock Zen master to write, because eventually he went up and he did well enough that they said, okay, you're now initiated as a Soto Zen priest and you've got it. Okay. So look for his book, Sit Down and Shut Up. It's really rather fun to read. And it tells how a guy who's into monster movies and Japanese, especially Japanese monster movies and Godzilla, how he wound up becoming a Zen priest. It's just absolutely wonderful. The other tradition of Zen, which is a little bit more sexy and gets more in the press or some of the writings, and Alan Watts was into it, you ask people a question and they keep thinking about the question. And basically you put a log jam into your thinking system and you go beyond thought to that moment of enlightenment. And then once you get it, you do more meditation to maintain it and stabilize it and everything. So there's a lot to be said there. But there are wonderful stories of people being enlightened, and one guy who had his thumb cut off, but the master knew that that was what was necessary at that point to bring about enlightenment. And so, boom, it happened. Because these enlightened masters know what's going to be exactly the skillful means, the very thing that's going to change the person's mind. Now, it's interesting because if you think about this, have you ever had the experience of somebody saying something to you and you go, oh, I never thought of it that way before? Some point was made to you, or you changed your mind about something, or you saw it differently? Kind of like the same way that if you look at a puzzle, an optical illusion, like the simple one where the stairs go up, but then, oh, you could also see it with the stairs going down. It's that kind of shift in your mind that this sudden school of enlightenment, wherever it exists, and it is in several traditions, it's in the Tibetan tradition too, under a different form, different practices. But that's the kind of thing that they are working with. That can be another interesting point that you can bring up to someone. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So remember, I'll take some questions and such too. Now, the other group that I wanted to mention, maybe a couple of others, is the Baha'i faith. Some of you folks may know about them, especially if you're from Chicago, because they have a huge temple on the north side of Chicago. It's actually, they put it right on a ley line. And the energy in this temple, you walk in and it's like you're walking into stuffed cotton all around you. The energy is so peaceful and so dense. And I think it's from some of the sacred architecture that they do. But just to explain briefly, the Baha'is are a worldwide faith. They were started in Iran, okay, about 150 years ago, something like that. They were started by two different men who said that they were prophets. They both lived at the same time. One of them was the Gate, who said that he was the return of the missing teacher of Shia Islam who had disappeared. And the other one was a follower of his. And then when the first one, the Bab, the Gate, was executed, the other one got the revelation that, hey, you're the next manifestation of God. And he started to preach. Well, what wound up happening was, since it was a reform movement, they got, and they still are, badly persecuted in Iran. They have spread throughout the whole world, and they have an interesting way of seeing the divine. They believe in one God, but they also believe that God periodically sends somebody down, just like that Hindu concept of avatar. God sends down a manifestation, and the manifestation periodically changes the regular rules that you have to run by, like the calendar and whether you can eat this thing or that thing. But then they add to the spiritual understanding of what's going on. So here's the thing. The Baha'is literally believe in Krishna, Buddha. They believe in Muhammad. They believe that a manifestation of God was originally Adam. They believe in, let me see, who else? The Bab and Baha'u'llah, of course. They also think that Baha'u'llah, who is the second one that showed up, was the prophesized return of the Buddha that was to be in the future, that sort of thing. And that Jesus was a manifestation, and so was Moses. So basically, they've done this thing called syncretism. Syncretism is the idea that you can take religions and put things together and come up with a whole new process. So they took this to an extreme. As a result, one of the interesting things that the Baha'is say is, for every Baha'i book, you should probably read three others from three other religions. And they are very, very good in working with and alongside all of the other faiths. Some Muslims have great problems with them because they see them as being apostate from Islam because of this. Okay. The Sunni Muslims probably less so, because they really recognize them as a separate religion. And the Shia Islam, a little bit shaky there. And like I said, they were persecuted quite a bit. But I've known a lot of Baha'is. I actually took classes when I was a teenager with a Baha'i, and I got to the point where I could continue the lecture even after the person went out to go and get cookies for everybody for what they call their fireside meetings, where you just hang out, have coffee, cookies, and discuss the faith. They're not into hardcore proselytizing, but they will give you opportunities to learn about their faith. Why am I not a Baha'i? Well, they have this structure. They have the ruling council, the Supreme Council, whatever they call it, Universal House of Justice. That's what it's called. And they don't have any women on it, in spite of saying that one of their primary things is the equality of men and women. They base this on the simple thing of Baha'u'llah having said somewhere, "Oh, men of the Universal House of Justice." And that's their excuse for keeping women out. Also, there have been some movements recently. If you dig around quite a bit, there's been kind of a fundamentalist movement, and people have been kicked out. But the biggest thing is, I just didn't believe that any one particular person or that particular way of looking at things was the way for me. Needless to say, nice folks, and they abstain from alcohol and tobacco. They do have divorce. Many of them tend more towards liberal politics, and they would easily recognize that, yes, there is definitely a spirituality to Wiccan faith and to what Wiccans are trying to do, because they would also see that, that there were other types of manifestations of God. There's even, from what I understand, a Baha'i who's trying to say that Quetzalcoatl for the Central Americans was probably a manifestation of God, and that the prophet of the Iroquois tribe who settled, got all the Iroquois tribes to be peaceful with each other and started their councils and got them all to agree on how they would govern themselves, which, by the way, was how the United States Constitution was patterned. That was probably a manifestation of God, but we simply don't know enough, So they are very open-minded and great to chat with and discuss with what's going on. And hanging out with them and getting their perspective on things. Also, Baha'u'llah wrote some very beautiful poetry, and they have some wonderful prayers. There's a prayer where they say, "Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit. I will no longer be a sorrowful person." It's in their prayer book. It's wonderful. It's one of my best, one of the best that they've written. So that's another interesting place to explore. And those are folks that you can definitely get along with. By the way, I think it's either North or South Carolina. It is the third largest religion in somewhere out there. I don't know how a bunch of Baha'is got out there, but for non-Christian groups, it's I think it's right behind some Muslims. So you might want to look around in your local area. If nothing else, those would be great allies for people. If people are accusing you of being an awful, nasty person, say, go talk to so-and-so, and a lot of these Baha'is have been in the community for a long time and people know them. And we need allies, folks, and we need to make bridges between people. And this is part of the reason why we are going to the parliament, to work with people, to get them to know what our ideas are, how they're different, and how they're not so different from some of their practices. The thing is, the basis for what we believe in comes from ancient sources. We're either inspired that way, our ancestors give us inspiration for some of these practices and some of these beliefs, or like some of our Norse brethren, they are looking into what's left of their writings and finding out what's important there. And doing analysis, by the way, the word for analysis of a sacred scripture is called an exegesis. It's funny, my late sister was a Pentecostal minister. And when she first went to her master's in divinity program, she went to theology school, which not all Pentecostals go to. She went there especially to get certified and trained in Christian counseling. But when she got there, she was wondering why everybody was talking about exiting Jesus. So, no, the word is exegesis, and you can do a newspaper article and do an exegesis on. It means to analyze the writing, okay, and you analyze it from different viewpoints, like where does it fit historically, what does the person believe who's writing it, what's the language that it was translated from, and how is that going to change things. So there's all of these different types of things. Oh yeah, thank you. Very nice. I got some nice compliments here. So that whole process of looking at sacred stuff is not something that we do a lot. We don't have a lot of sacred writings in Wicca, but we do have things that we can look to, like the Norse myths, like the Greek myths. And also, one of my teacher's favorites, I encourage you all to look up the golden verses of the Pythagoreans, because the Pythagoreans were a big influence philosophically on what later became known as Hermeticism. Hermeticism was the ancient philosophy of the Eastern Mediterranean. The purest strain of it now is the Hebrew Kabbalah, but also it made its way into the West through Greek philosophy. It made its way into the West through Kabbalah. It also made its way in through the Greek magical papyri and the Goetia, the various ways of working with the magical spirits in the West that made it into the grimoires of ceremonial magic from the Middle East. And so Hermeticism, you can be a Hermeticist and be a Wiccan. You could be a Hermeticist and be a Catholic. You can be a Hermeticist and be a Jew, okay? All of these strains look back to those legendary writings from a figure who is called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes thrice great, thought to be an incarnation of Mercury. Well, he was thought to have been maybe around the same time as Moses, but later scholarship showed that the writings were maybe from 200-300 AD. But they were obviously influenced from earlier Egyptian thought. And that idea of emanations of reality, of the way creation works, of as above, so below, that's so dear to us Wiccans, of reflections of the universe and of the interconnection of everything in the universe, all of that made it into Wicca also, and into Western occultism. So we have this trend and this pattern that traces all the way through all of this, and we are part of that pattern. Remember, just as Cicero said that everything is connected to everything else, the Buddhists also have this thing that they call interdependent origination. What in the world is that? Well, their idea is that you can't say that something is said to exist unless it exists independently, fully. But nothing exists independently. I came from my parents. Who I am was a result of all of the teachers that I've had, the relationships that I've had, the people that I've known, hanging out with people at Starwood dancing naked around the bonfire, telling jokes with Lon Milo DeCat, or for that matter, standing in the shower at Starwood and talking with Donald Michael Craig in this absolutely hilarious time where we both were talking about being hypnotherapists, and him talking about how when he's working with people, which I've used, to quit smoking with hypnosis, that he reminds them that one of the things in a cigarette is methane. And the other source for methane is a cow's butt. And if you smoke a cigarette, remember, that's just like, and the rest is obvious, but we are all made up of those marvelous times with people, of part of our communities, of the teachers that we've had, both in Wicca and in life otherwise, of the people who teach us by their bad example sometimes, or by the mistakes that our teachers have made, which is a good source of wisdom, because they'll tell you the mistakes that they've made and listen to them, okay? By learning from our own mistakes, but learning from our relatives, our parents, and all the rest. So we have this interdependent origination. We are connected in. And that is certainly one of the things that we see from our great inspiration in the craft, which is Wicca and which is nature. And looking at, look, we have a forest behind us. What can we learn from that forest that I have as that little imaginary background for me? We have things growing. We can learn from that. We have things that stand up to a storm better because they're flexible. We have things that exist because they make 1,000,000 seeds and some of them sprout. Well, what things have we planted in our lives, folks? What things have we seeded in our lives and said to other people? And what things will sprout around us? Okay? Nature can teach us. Our teachers can teach us. These other faiths can teach us also. All of those things come together to form who we are, and we continue in a particular line that will be our continuance, but as kind of a mind stream, as maybe not a particular thing, but as an influence. So keep in mind your influence that you are doing as you go through life. Influence and work with all these other faiths. Give them a hand, talk to them, give us a hand at the Parliament here and help us get there so that we can spread some of our wisdom to these other folks and let them know that we stand with them and that we are part of the community of youth.
Alan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. This has been so informative.
Yeah,
So
well,
thank you
I've collected
so much.
religions for a lot of years. So this is kind of the fruit of it. Mhm.
Obviously, the next time the grandkids say, "Hey, Gra, what about this faith?" I'm going to say, "Hang on, I got to message my friend here."
Yeah, as much as I can, I'll help people out, and of course, there's a lot of books out there, some better than others. But hey, if you make it to the Parliament, talk to the people themselves. They're happy to chat with you.
Definitely.
Okay.
So thank you again. We are going to go to donation break, and I will post the links to donate or bid in the auction. And I want to thank everyone who's been with us. We also want to have a shout out to Reverend Don Lewis for donating $10. Thank you so much, Reverend Don. So that is putting us right now. We are at $630 towards our goal of 10,000. So thank you to everyone who supported us. Please do donate, bid in the auction, a $5 donation. If 100 people donate $5, that's $500. So, and
And
if you
remember,
can't donate, if you could share the link,
yeah,
share the videos, that would be great, and ask other people to support us. So, Alan, once more, thank you so much for being with us. And we
absolutely.
are going to go to donation break now.
Great. And I'm going to get
You're watching the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon. The team here would like to thank you for all of your support in assisting us in bringing a contingent
I'm
of
off to dinner
paladins to
now.
the Parliament of the World's Religions
Thank you so
in
much
Chicago,
for watching
Illinois,
over me
in
and
August
making this
of this
so
year.
much easier.
We are trying to raise $10,000 to assist with the basic needs of housing, food, and travel expenses. Here are some words from the members of the event team on why it is important that we reach that goal.
Hello, I'm Right Reverend Sir Elizabeth, Program Director of the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon. Thank you so much for tuning in to our weekend-long event as we raise $10,000 to bring a contingent of paladins to the Parliament of the World's Religions coming up in August. We need to house and feed about 20 of us over in Chicago for 7 days. And to do that, we're going to need at least 10 grand. So here's our ask. go to Correllians.live/donate and make us a monetary donation to our cause. Every dollar helps. We also have psychic readers and an auction you can participate in too. If you can't make a monetary donation, then do us another very big favor and share the event with your friends over social media. You can find us on the Pagan World TV app on Roku, Correllians Live and Magic TV via YouTube, and Correllians.live via any web browser. Thank you so much for your help and enjoy the show.
Hello, everybody. I am Reverend Sir Richard Donahue, also known as Cloud the Pagan Rapper, and I am a member of the Order of Paladins. Now, to help us send a contingent to the Parliament of World's Religions, to me, means one thing: community. It's the idea of coming together with multiple faiths for common goals. And it is paramount for the pagan community to have a seat at that table. And I, for one, am very, very proud that we are afforded this opportunity to do so. But to do that, we do need your help. We're trying to raise $10,000 so that we can feed and house the contingency of paladins that will be going to the Parliament. And it's through your help that we're going to be able to get there and represent the community in the best possible way that we can. So please, smash that donate button, all right? Smash that donate button. You can go to Correllians.live to donate. And I want to thank you guys for taking part in the telethon, okay? Check out our auction. Get yourself a reading from Divinationality. Do all of the things that we have provided for you throughout these 3 days, and let us come together in community and achieve our goal and allow us paladins to go and represent us at Parliament. Thank you very much. May you all blessed be.
One of the best things about Parliament is one of the best things that we need in our society, which is unity, compassion, and fellowship, which is something I'm extremely looking forward to. And I hope that this will be inspiration for the future and helping us to be more as one in the community. So join us, continue to join us. Thank you for sharing and liking our posts, and please continue to sponsor us.
At the Parliament of World Religions in 2023, I'm personally looking forward to broad exposure and deep engagement with various wisdom traditions from around the world, particularly as regards pressing issues from today and future goals for our human journey. I expect that I'll be able to incorporate much of the learning back into my own personal path, as well as share tangible insights back into the metaphysical and spiritual community that I work within.
From all of us here at the 2023 Correllians Live Telethon, we want to thank you again for your support. Please be sure to check out Divination Alley and get yourself a reading. Or check out our online auction that is overflowing with wonderful craft items, books, and services for sale. Remember, our goal is to raise $10,000, so please help us spread the word about the event, our cause, and be sure to stay tuned for more. So thank you all again, and may you all blessed be. Enjoy the telethon.